Hello there. Welcome to Nerd.World History. This is a new channel that I'm doing. I have two other channels that are a little more established than this one called Nerd.World, Nerd.World Films. If you're interested in general trivia, pop culture, movie news, and movie discussions, as well as various cult television series such as Star Trek, Andromeda, Battlestar Galactica, etc., please head over there, check them out. There's links in the description below. This video, in case you haven't guessed from clicking on the icon, is a history review. Now, it's a bit of a discussion of a what if. The First World War is well known to be the starting point in history for the first true tanks. Anything that existed before that was a mobile armoured vehicle was nothing like a tank. The first tanks were developed by the British under the instructions of, randomly, the Royal Navy under Winston Churchill as land ships. Now, a maybe not so logical progression of that technology was the development of certain really heavy tanks that were built by different nations during the First World War or just after it. Now, of course, the tank made its debut, the first tanks, the British tanks, at the Battle of the Somme in 1916. But we're not discussing those. We're going to discuss, as I said, a what-if tank. It was never technically built, but it was designed, and it's a weird one. It's the British Flying Elephant, a sort of super heavy tank that was both way before its time and ludicrous. In my opinion, or at least in observation, it seems to take some inspiration from the German KVs from the First World War that were not a good tank. The Germans got their act together by the Second World War, but in the First World War they didn't know what to do with a tank. They didn't really know what to do. They were more like a mobile pillbox, and the Flying Elephant was kind of that. An insanely too heavy, underpowered, over-armoured, over-armed, overmanned, overly engineered waste of time, and luckily someone figured that out before they wasted their time building it. So, getting into the history and development of this weird vehicle. Before we get started, please like, share and subscribe and comment down below. And now, let's get started. Now, before we get started, I should point out that not all the design specifications for this tank have survived into the modern age, but what has survived we're going to go through, and it is mad. This tank is insane. Now, a lot of people think that the first super heavy modern battle tank idea was thought up during the Second World War with vehicles like the King Tiger, which weighed 60 odd tons and were just insanely overpowered. But actually, during the First World War, tanks that were as heavy or even heavier were both envisioned and even built by some nations, either as, again, during the First World War or immediately thereafter. And the Flying Elephant was the British attempt at this sort of idea. And it weighed something like 100 tons, or would have weighed about 100 tons, which is insane when you think about the weight of vehicles that were trotting around during the early 20th century. It was powered, underpowered really would have been, by two Daimler engines. That's British Daimler, not German Daimler. There was two companies that provided the engines for this vehicle, which were probably thought to be underpowered for the weight and power of the vehicle. It was armed in specifications in design A with a 57mm 6-pounder gun, or in its design A, rather, that was design B, it had a 12-pounder, much more powerful, higher caliber gun, as well as, of course, machine guns. Now, despite the fact that this vehicle was pretty much insane, it was designed, initially conceived as a sort of attack vehicle, but eventually was reworked as a sort of tank destroyer to combat the large and formidable vehicles being produced by Germany. At least that was the perception. Of course, back then, people didn't really know how to use a tank. They didn't know what they were going to be for. The idea of the sort of armoured spear of an army wasn't around. People were toying with different ideas, even in the First World War. Was it an infantry support tank? Did you need a cruiser? Did you need some sort of high combination, a sort of an all-rounder? Was the tank going to be a follow-up vehicle, or was it a charging vehicle? Now, at certain battles in the First World War, such as the Battle of the Somme, the tank was used to great effect in number, and it was determined that using the tank as a sort of armoured spear was a good idea. But tanks were too easily knocked out, blah blah blah. They were quite crude and they'd often have mechanical problems, but that was a problem that would be fixed over time. basically people still didn't really know, and there was still a thought process that maybe there was another use for them, or maybe just a myriad of different vehicles was just as good as having one all-rounder. This was an experiment as other nations were doing it, so we got on board with it. And it went through a few design phases, and ultimately we believe that it did begin construction but was never actually finished. The original prototype was never completed and was likely scrapped. It was also noted that the War Ministry wanted a reduction in the weight of the vehicle. It may have reduced in weight to like 50-60 tons rather than the 100 tons, but again, it was never actually finished, so we don't really know. The vehicle would have been, in my opinion, a complete waste of time. The German tanks that were similar didn't really impress, and the only real major tank-on-tank battle of the First World War, which was not exactly inconclusive, was against 3 British tanks versus 3 German. The Germans were defeated by what on paper may have looked like inferior British tanks. I mean, they were smaller, lighter, thinner armour, fewer guns, but they were better built, faster, more manoeuvrable, and could get a shot off. And the Germans had a sort of fixed turret gun at the front. I mean, so did the British, but at least they could fire a bit. Their tank was also more manoeuvrable. It had better cross-country performance. The idea of these sort of big mobile pillboxes was something maybe of a back burner idea that someone thought was a good idea on paper, but in practice turned out to be not so clever. Ultimately, the Flying Elephant was never actually finished as superior, better designs. For example, the Renault tank coming out of France were deemed to be the future, with a turret on top, and this sort of combined armoured force idea was becoming more and more appealing, and a big slow-moving, lumbering vehicle didn't really fit into that concept of mobility and power, as it was, as I said, it was pretty much a mobile pillbox. But it is a funny design. It's the idea that someone thought this was a good idea 100 years ago. It's insane. The German tanks in general during the First World War are kind of nuts, and I'm always surprised at how ridiculous they are, because they're not the best. They were very top heavy. Their center of gravity was too high, so their cross country performance, of course, was mediocre at best. They required a crew of at least 18 personnel. And it's reasonable to conclude, although I can't find anything specifically relating to what the crew complement would have been necessary to run the Flying Elephant, they were a similar vehicle, similar size. They were 27 feet long, weighed 100 tons, covered in some, I think it was 6 machine guns they were supposed to have. In the German version, those machine guns required a 2-man crew to operate, so you're looking at maybe minimum of 1, probably 2 personnel to run them, probably a couple of engineers, a communications officer, a tank commander, a couple of drivers, as well as a forward gunner and maybe a loader. You're looking at probably a similar number, like 18 personnel, just to run this one vehicle, which would have probably had a maximum speed of at most 4 or 5 miles per hour. And I think the German one could only move at about 2 or 3. It was before its time. The technology hadn't caught up with it, and by the time the technology would have caught up to make a vehicle like this viable, the tactics of war had leaps and bounds gone ahead of it. But it's still an interesting concept, what-if vehicle, if we'd actually built this. It's sometimes interesting to see the sort of insane vehicles that are built in the past and experimented with. For example, like the Elephant of the Second World War, built by the Germans. On paper, again, looked like a brilliant idea, until someone realised, send it out to the Battle of Kursk, and like, that thing's no machine guns on it. It only got a big gun. You have to keep it so far back that the enemy can't get to it, because it had no ability to fight off infantry. This thing certainly had the ability to fight off infantry, or would have done, but probably that's about it. But that's all I have for this video. I just wanted to cover it when I was doing a bit of research on First World War tanks recently, as tanks are something of a passion, and I bore my girlfriend endlessly with them. And I came across this, and I was reminded of it when I was doing my research, and I thought, that is so ridiculous. I love it. I love stupid, insane things like that. All the same, hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment down below. Check out my other 2 channels, and bye-bye.